Hey folks, this is Ben, and I am recording this after Ethan and I have recorded our podcast episode for this week, where we talk about the long length muscle training panacea, or what I like to call the long length panacea. This podcast is going to be divided into two parts. So you're listening to this now. This is part one. Part two will be next week, released next week. So the podcast from this week stops rather abruptly. So I'm telling you as to why that stop has occurred. Again, this is part one. We talk mostly about the long leg thing with some other associated topics. And then next week, I'll give another intro. I hope you enjoy this episode, and I'll see you all next week. All right, folks. So, Ethan, as as with, I wonder how many people get that
The
get
reference.
that reference. I'm not going to explain it because for anyone that gets it, I mean, it needs no explanation. Anyway, with every passing day and with every passing week, the long length deep stretch conversation, with every second that goes by, with every piece of content that is created, there is yet another drip in the pool of overgeneralized bullshit around training. And I feel like a responsibility to continue to talk about the stretch position stuff, the long length stuff, because of how much everyone else is talking about it. Like, I feel like for every action, there needs to be from other content creators like a sort of reasonable reaction from those actions. So if in the cultural space of lifting, people are talking about stretching and how awesome stretching is, right? I think it's important that there are some people that say, hey, stretching can be great, but let's talk about the sort of nuances of stretching and when it may or may not be appropriate for you. So in the same sense, I'm announcing that I will continue to talk about long length training for as long as other people are making oversimplified recommendations, blanket recommendations about like what people should do. So I did some writing on it this week, and I'm settled on naming the conversation the long length panacea. Okay, which I like. We're on board with that. I see a head nod there. On board with that. And I think panacea is the perfect term. And for those that don't know what a panacea is kind of like it's like it's used a lot in medicine, but it's like a one size fits all solution to that is sort of looked at as like the solution to all these different problems, just neatly packaged in this one concept. And and I think that mobility training specifically is also kind of a panacea, like mobility as a whole is approached that way. And oftentimes when we see these kinds of patterns emerge, what happens is there's a particular concept that is looked at as inherently good with no downsides. Like the good side is presented, the downsides are not presented. And as a consequence of that, what people recommend is based off of only the good, or really only a couple variables that are associated with the larger topic. So to be more granular, specific, in the context of like long muscle length training, we tend to see people now making blanket recommendations or statements about exercise, wherein the only aspect variable of that exercise that they're looking at is the muscle length thing. And you and I have discussed this a bunch of times before, but now what's happening is like a different thing than is happening before. So what sort of transitioned me into this more aggressive like push against it, I think recently, is just how it's kind of the long leg thing. It's been moving from a topic that's like only been discussed as like a research thing initially, like, oh, this is an interesting question, to then it's sort of working its way into, or it has worked its way into like influencer recommendations, where we're sort of ranking exercises based on this variable alone. And now what's happening is it's actually working its way into common speech, wherein people don't even like, it's almost like molding itself into the way that people think about exercise inherently, as this thing where we can just look at any exercise And even people that are not like in the fitness space are now starting, like I'm hearing this from people that are not even remotely involved in the same bubbles that I am. So it's kind of just like this general spreading, and now it's like we're using it in common language to basically represent better exercises, worse exercises. Okay. So long-winded preface, which is basically just to say that I'd like to present the most immediate downside to the long length thing, and really where I think uh, people don't recognize the potential flaws in only doing stretch focus work. Because an example of like how it's worked into more common areas is someone will ask me the question, um, why would you do this variation if it doesn't like stretch the muscle more or something like that? So to respond to that person is or the direction I think is important to go at this is to look at every exercise never just as like a muscle specific thing, but also as a joint specific thing. And we have talked about how specifically, and I'll let you handle most of this thread in response to this. We've talked about how the long length training thing is kind of like a more is more situation where we might just be creating more tension in a target tissue. And that's why we might see a more robust hypertrophy response. But with achieving more in an exercise, with creating more tension in the quads, let's say, there is also more tension in, let's say, the patellofemoral joint. So let's compare like a leg extension to a squat. People will say, like, let's just do like really deep squats. So let's just use the bottom end of the range and like screw the leg extension because it's not like a lengthened thing. Well, along with the squat comes a much higher magnitude of force on patellofemoral compression and patellofemoral shear. Now, those are just two like force descriptions, right? But it's basically just to say that, yeah, there might be more tension in your quads, but what else sort of has to come along with that increased tension? It's more tension in the quadriceps the tendon, the more tension in the patellofemoral tendon or the patellar tendon. It's more stress between the patella or the kneecap and the femur. It's more stress between the connective tissues inside of the actual joint capsule, right? So tendons, ACL, PCL, MCL, the menisci, right? All the different little joint structures that people don't even really know exist. Those things also have to deal with the whole more is more tension, more stretch, more work, more reps, more weight. And those tissues are tissues that are much slower at recovering, for lack of a better way to describe it. So if you end up in a situation where every exercise that you're doing is heavily stretch focused, heavy tension in the stretch is the only sort of range that you're using. Not only are you, yes, maybe creating more tension in the target tissue, but you're also creating more tension, more stress in the structures that need to actually move and support the tension that is in the target tissue. And so I think that, just to be concrete, if you say throw out all leg extension variations and you are doing squats twice a week, 3 times a week, you're doing 10, 15 sets of squats instead of maybe doing 6 to 8 sets of squats with some sets of leg extensions, you may be getting more, or what you think is more, in the short term, but in the long term, you may be creating these joint responses, these joint stresses that you're perpetually sort of not fully recovering from. And I think that that is the number one argument maybe that I could make against just making all of your motions stretch focus motions, wherein including something like a leg extension can allow you to train the quads in a way where you're still getting high tension in a variety of different positions. You're still seeing hypertrophy, right? Because we are still seeing hypertrophy from short focus variations, but just the total magnitude of stress is lower on the quads, and therefore the total magnitude of stress potentially on the knee itself, and the structures that support the knee is also lower. So that's all to say that I think the biggest argument in favor of short position training is just like, hey, we can continue to do this same thing or a similar thing with just less orthopedic cost, less joint stress. And I really think that that is becoming something that's increasingly undervalued, because as we discussed, like so much of this stuff just comes down to how long can you train hard for? Like how many years in sequence are you going to be able to do this? It's not just this question of, do I get more right now, but can I sustain what I'm doing for weeks, months, and years to come. So a little bit all over the place in terms of that explanation, but I wind up at the end of that just with this conclusion that I really appreciate the short focused work, because whenever I find that in my own training, I'm starting to get those kinds of like aches and like weird things that I really think shouldn't be associated with resistance training, I always double down on like, okay, what percentage of the time am I spending in these really stretched position versus these short positions focus stuff? And I just sort of make sure that I'm maintaining some degree of volume in those lower stress environments, so that not only those tissues can get trained, but in a way that's potentially less costly to the structures that sort of support the motion and support the ability to continue to progress, both in terms of strength and then also in terms of size. So, in terms of the more is more thing, could you just elaborate on what you had in mind, or if anything specifically came up for you in response to any of the things that I just mentioned? I'd like to kind of expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah, I have like 10 things come up and they're like spilling out of my ears right now. So I got to get them out of my brain before I
Yeah,
forget.
yeah, go go.
Um, as just like a visual for this concept of just trying to pick the perfect exercise, the one that just gives you the most stimulus per rep, so to speak. I almost visualize like taking a bucket, to the beach or something and trying to fill it up with rocks. And you're like, okay, if I just want to use the fewest amount of rocks, I'll put big ass rocks into this bucket. And it's like, yeah, I could either put like three big ass rocks or, like 20 small rocks into the bucket. But the reality is, like, if you put three big ass rocks, there's still a lot of empty space.
Mm,
So, and also, it's when you go from three to four, now the bucket's overflowing.
hmm
Whereas when you fill it with small rocks, it's a lot more granular, so to speak, and you can make changes with less overall risk of overshooting. So you have more margin. You are able to fill in the gaps, so to speak. So it's like, okay, maybe you can do this many sets of this one exercise. It's almost like eating a meal where it's like, yeah, you can eat this much pasta, but then you could also eat this many cookies and you could eat that much ice cream and then you could drink that much soda.
yeah.
It just, as a general rule, I think almost like a law, so to speak, just something that we see across many different areas is variability. Just variance is generally the best way to fill the bucket, and a high degree of specificity usually leads to quicker burnout or overshooting whatever you're trying to do, whether that's feeling full, whether that's injury rates. If we look at injury rates of like other sports versus strength sports, or one strength sport to the next, if we look at powerlifting versus bodybuilding, for example, you do tend to see that just like a high degree of specificity is something that in general leads to higher injury rates.
hmm
So I just think that is one of the advantages that we have with building muscle is it doesn't require a super high degree of specificity. So you want to use that to your advantage. And usually more variability comes with more survivability. And that's kind of the name of the game. And then in general, I think, we should use research, to inform our decisions and to kind of like give us a less narrow and more nuanced view of a topic. But you should also zoom all the way out and just look at across time where do people eventually land on and what's working for people over long durations, because research of this sort tends to be done over really short time periods, and you don't really get to fully measure this thing we call fatigue accumulate over short time periods. So a lot of times you're just looking at this like stimulus, so to speak, but not really measuring quote unquote fatigue. So it does come back to, this concept that's now like popular parlance of like stimulus to fatigue, but it's such a broad concept that a lot of times we have to be more specific. And we also have to be specific, not only about the type, but of how duration affects that? Like, what are the time scales of these things? And a lot of things just take time to accumulate issues, and we don't get to measure them over short periods. So it's better sometimes to look observationally long term and pair that with the mechanistic and the short term research, and then try to piece together a picture from there. So if you just look at really strong people, really, experienced bodybuilders, they all tend, most of them tend to migrate towards an approach where they're doing short bias stuff first in their training. And they give different reasons for that. It might be like, I do this, to warm up my knees. I do this, to get a better mind muscle connection. Some people may be like, I've gotten injured on this other exercise before, but I have to use less load if I do this first. Like, there's a whole host of different reasons. But I just think as a general trend, we see people migrate there over time. And it also makes sense from the standpoint of, you might not need to start there as a novice. You may be able to get away with just these like higher magnitude stresses off the bat because they're not being magnified by your output.
Mm.
When you're really big and strong, everything gets magnified. So it's like, if you need to eat 2,000 calories a day, like I can eat almost any type of food to fill that 2,000 calories, and my digestion's going to be pretty good. But if I have to eat 8,000 calories a day, I have to be a little bit more mindful of what I'm filling that 8,000 with, because it's being multiplied now 4x, from the 2,000. So I think there's a huge multiplier when it comes to strength. And that's where you see this stuff actually play out. So a lot of people who just haven't worked with more advanced athletes who either have been doing it a long time or have built up a tremendous amount of strength, they just never see these things magnified. So they exist, but it just never comes out for them because it doesn't get magnified again enough. So you don't train long enough, don't train hard enough, don't train heavy enough, and I say enough, I just mean enough to magnify the effect. So they think the effect doesn't exist, but it's just simply the scale that they're looking at it.
Yeah, and I want to, first of all, the bucket analogy was a really perfect one to much more simply describe what I was trying to with stress distribution. So that was great. I had previously, for some reason, not thought of that because the analogy that I've used was just it was still a bucket, but I was imagining like, imagine if you only had like a fixed amount that you could fill it up with, and eventually the water overflows if the cup you're using is too big for what you have to sort of pour in. But the rock thing makes way more sense. I think another good example of that, it's a little bit different in terms of um it's a little bit different in terms of the qualities that we're describing, but you mentioned that some people like to do like short bias stuff before long bias stuff because it feels a little bit better on the joints. I think another layer of that is the conversation around why doing things like curls before triceps, like biceps before triceps, and like maybe leg curls before leg extensions. I think that comparison is an interesting one. And I look at it in the same way where let's imagine, you can handle just for sake of argument, if you could handle 5 sets of triceps in a day, you might be able to handle 6 to 8 sets of curls. And I think a big reason, again, very generalized, but I think a big reason for that is that you have more elbow flexors than you have more elbow extensors, in the sense that all of your triceps converge down to this exact same common tendon on the backside of your elbow, but on the front side of your elbow you have the stress that's distributed through each head of your biceps. Right at the radial tuberosity you have the brachioradialis and you have the brachialis, all of which actually attach to different sites. So by definition, anytime you do a curl, the stress around your elbow and forearm is just immediately more distributed as compared to the triceps, right? Same thing for leg curls versus leg extensions, where if you do any kind of leg extension exercise, or whether it be a squat or an actual leg extension, all of the tension has to traverse down through your patella, right? All those tendons converge to that common one in the quad tendon. But if you're doing a leg curl or any leg curl variation, that stress per unit of leg curl repetition is way more distributed, right? You have your semitendinosus, your semimembranosus, your biceps long head, biceps short head, lateral gastroc, medial gastroc, sartorius, gracilis, TFL. Like there's literally 9 muscles on the backside of the knee that can actually move the tibia in the direction of knee bending. And so per unit of leg extension, the stress distribution is much lower relative to the leg curl. So it's not necessarily that like, doing curls in your elbow or your knee is inherently just less stressful, but it's more so that the torque that is going through either side of the joint in either case, in the case of quads and triceps, is much more local to a single point or a much sort of smaller surface area. Whereas if you're doing a leg curl or any kind of biceps curl, the stress at the level of the forearm, elbow, or knee is just baked into the cake in a way where the stress is not we'll say on that same sort of focal point. So in the same way that maybe you would do a leg extension and a squat, I'm looking at this at a sort of more muscle specific level, where when we're looking at anything extension driven, elbow or knee, we're talking about a more local stress. And then when we're talking about knee flexion, elbow flexion, we're looking at a more distributed stress. Does that kind of make sense in terms of what I was trying, like the comparison I was trying to draw between those two things? Because if it wasn't clear for you, I don't know if it will be for others.
I think some people might then jump to the question, well, Ben, does that mean I can do a higher volume of biceps than I can of triceps and higher volume of hamstrings versus quads? Because like you're talking about it on a muscular level, but there's
Yeah,
also joint forces involved. So it's like, are you doing barbell curls or are you doing cable curls? Like
yeah,
how, how is your knee and femur set up when you do the seated leg curls? Oh, but when you do RDLs, there's also the spine involved. And so there's all these other components to this end result of like, well, can I actually just, survive more of training this one muscle than another muscle? So I just
right.
want to note that at no point did you say that's what you should do, just simply that it's a consideration.
Right. And I think the same applies for pulling and pressing. Like historically, you hear people saying that they like to pull before pressing, or that they can handle more pulling volume. And that might have to do with the fact that you have many more muscles on your back than you do like on your front to press versus to pull. So yeah, we could make the same argument that any pulling force is distributed to a greater degree than any pushing force. But simultaneously, it also depends on like, well, are you using a machine pull down that's really, really heavy in the lengthened position, or are you doing a bunch of cable rows, a bunch of cable pull downs that are inherently just set up so that per unit rep, all those reps are less stressful than, let's say, even something like a free weight press or something like a Smith press, et cetera. So yeah, so the length variation and then also the stress distribution variation and then also the amount of sets that you can do relative to those things is definitely different. I think that if I had to kind of make a conclusion about that, it has much more to do with what you're referencing, which is things like joint alignment relative to individual comfort, and then also resistance profile. I think those two things are probably more impactful in terms of how much you're able to handle than just the theory about, how distributed is the stress from a muscular perspective. But in general, if someone were to gun to my head situation, be like, could someone handle more volume of leg curls or leg extensions? I would put money on people being able to handle more volume of leg curls, but that would be unrealistic in terms of, as you're saying, looking at all the different variables. Because in your experience, right, for example, it's not necessarily the case that you can do a lot more leg curling than leg extending because of how specific, intentional, and sort of focused you are on things like setup and execution and profile and tempo and all those
Yeah, it's like,
sorts
is
of
it
things.
seated leg curl or lying leg curl? Now we have a length difference and then the
Yeah.
profile. But if you were just saying like lying leg curls, on your average lying leg curl machine versus leg extension, potentially.
Yeah.
And there's also just like, how are we categorizing muscles? A lot of times when people are counting up sets, they say these are sets for my back. and these are sets for my chest.
Hmm.
It's like, yeah, we have different subdivisions of the pack, but when you say back, it was actually a lot of different muscles on your back. We didn't say like front of the torso and back of the torso, but the back of the torso is getting categorized as one muscle. The back side, everything from the waist up, whereas the front side is broken into individual muscles,
Right.
uh, front delt, etc. So, to some degree, it's just like how many different muscles are you training and how differentiated are those muscles from like a plane of resistance standpoint. And the more differentiated they are, as far as like, the positions that you're moving through, probably the more exercises you need to train them if you are training them in a differentiated way. If you're not, then there's probably different stresses that you need to talk about as well, like for example, at the trunk, spine, whatnot. So
Yeah. Like if you did, 50 sets of reverse flies, um, I really doubt that you would ever run into fatigue issues related to your lats, you know. Like if you just only did reverse flies for a decade versus if you only did, rows or pull downs or something, those outcomes would be quite different relative to if you only did like let's say decline presses and versus if you only did incline presses. Like there's a lot more overlap in terms of the front stuff being one muscle versus the back stuff being one muscle. Yeah. Which is interesting, right? Because all the muscles that we call pressors, you know, we call the pecs a pressor, we call the quads a pressor, we call the triceps a pressor. Those muscles all have, or those groups of muscles, those actions all have much more in common in terms of the stress distribution, and all the pulling things have much more in common. So, the back, there's a lot more shit on the back for a row to contribute relative to a press. There's a lot more shit that can contribute to a leg curl than can contribute to a leg extension. A lot more elbow flexors than there are elbow extensors and so on. So I think it's cool to kind of see those patterns. But like you're saying in practice, because of those other variables, it definitely doesn't end up, I think, at least in a case like yours, being that the volumes are super different. But I think very commonly, the way that people end up doing those motions makes it so that, yeah, I can handle more pulling volume, or yeah, I can handle more hamstrings volume. Um, like you said, just because of those other variables. So was there anything else you wanted to touch on in terms of the lengthened conversation, the Panacea?
yeah, I think just the distinction between it being a lengthened conversation and a stretch mediated conversation. I think that those are two things that, at least for the time being, we need to create a significant amount of space between. I think there's a little bit too much overlap in terms of how people are using it in conversation. I think part of it is just that like the research on both of them were coming out around the same time. Maybe some of the stretch stuff was a little bit more heavily talked about, and then right after that we started talking about training at long muscle lengths, and the two just kind of got blended together as if because they were being researched heavily at the same time that there were somehow the same mechanisms. So the stretch mediated stuff has been a topic of study for a long time, and a lot of people will be familiar with the animal models, like the avian models, which is just bird models where they're like loading a bird's wings and they're putting them in a loaded stretch position many times for days on end.
I feel badly for those birds, man. Imagine if you were just walking around and like this force from God was just like pulling your arm up, for several days at a time. That would be absolutely miserable.
Whatever it takes, man.
Yeah, whatever it takes.
So, if there was a device and I could survive it.
Yeah, yeah. If then for you, there's also that consideration of like, well, what is it doing to your spine and all that stuff. But
I mean, in their case, like the hypertrophy was so beyond uh, just like orders of magnitude beyond what we've ever seen in human research. Um, it was like the significance of it was something that you might see more in like a potent drug, whereas when it comes to like changes in hypertrophy in research and whether or not that's significant, we have so few subjects in a study, and the magnitude of change is so small that it's almost always like insignificant in a sense. But with the birds, it was like, doubling of muscle mass or tripling. I don't remember exactly, just off the top of my head, but there was also hyperplasia seen. So not just like growth of the muscle fibers, but also like new muscle fibers. So that was something that was then hypothesized that maybe, this is occurring in humans through that mechanism. And through many decades between that research and the current research on stretch mediated hypertrophy, people would incorporate like intraset uh, stretching in their program. So hit a set, hit a deep stretch. There was DC training, which did like loaded stretches. So there's a long history of people using stretching, um, with the goal of driving more hypertrophy in some way, shape, or form. But then in more recent years, there was research coming out of more Eastern, I don't know if China, Japan, but like that part of the world, uh, looking specifically at long duration stretching and long duration in humans. We're talking about like an hour at a time, like 6, 7 days a week at like an 8 out of 10 as far as like discomfort goes. So
Oh, this was like with the calf study, right?
yeah,
The
yeah,
boot.
calves are where it was mostly trialed in.
Yeah.
So that, there was a specific researcher. If it's not in like, China, and I got the part of the world totally wrong. Because as I'm thinking about it now, I'm like, I might be confusing that with BFR.
Mm.
So it matters, but I'm not the guy who's gonna be like, this was the researcher's name and this was the year. Like, I can barely remember the names of my friends.
I think you're thinking of the researcher's name is Mao.
Yeah.
Mao et al. 20 something, That's what we'll go with.
Either way, like the main takeaway is that we're talking about long durations. We're talking about things that are not happening in a gym setting. It's like a boot that you put on and you tighten this boot, it pulls you into dorsiflexion, and you're holding this, for a total duration of like 6+ hours a week. And there were some studies that did a little bit less, but when you then look at the literature on training at long muscle lengths, it doesn't really resemble that at all. We're just simply talking about things that people are already do exercises people are already doing in the gym, and we're talking about loading people with actual weights, and the amount of time that they're spending in those positions is just absolutely minuscule compared to this extended duration of stretching. So the mechanisms are still not totally clear on like what drives quote stretch mediated hypertrophy when you have people in a boot for hours on end. Maybe there's some occlusion effects. Um, you see that it occurs more in men on average than it does in women. So maybe women are just starting off a little bit more flexible, and there's some kind of like direct mechanism to actually create, because they do get changes in their amount of flexibility by the end of the study. They're able to passively get into more dorsiflexion. Maybe there's something happening there. It's not totally clear in either the case of true stretch mediated hypertrophy, which I should also mention is not like of super high magnitude. Like you can get the same results doing like a few sets a few times a week of calf raises as you can doing like 6, 7 hours of stretching.
Mhm. Mhm.
So it's not this super robust response like we would see in an animal model where it's probably a higher intensity and certainly a much longer duration. But then when it comes to lifting and this concept of training at longer muscle lengths comes up, I think people conflate that by saying, "Oh, I'm at a long muscle length, and stretching tends to happen at long muscle lengths. So therefore, the mechanism behind why long muscle length training is effective is because of the stretch." And we could make an entire podcast on this, and we have touched on the subject before. And then, ironically, I think a few months after we had first talked about this subject, Stronger by Science, not that they're, you know, listening into our podcasts or anything, but they had a really good, I just want to point people in the direction of a podcast they did talking about longer muscle lengths. And I was happy to hear that that conversation came up, that long muscle lengths and stretch mediated hypertrophy, they did a great job at sort of laying out the data on why there's not necessarily an overlap between the two. Not that there isn't somewhere. Almost everything is going to have overlap with something else in the body in some way, shape, or form. Like you could find a reason, to say that they have crossover in this place or that place. They probably share some mechanism somewhere, but I don't think we have evidence to support that the two are the same thing by any means. So that takes us to like, well, what are some possible hypotheses as to what could be happening with long muscle length training? And if we're taking this idea of stretch mediated hypertrophy mostly off the table, we can think about what do we already know as far as signaling goes for hypertrophy, and what could be some more obvious explanations as to potentially why we get a more potent hypertrophy response training at longer versus shorter muscle lengths. Are there just some areas that might be obvious and might be often overlooked when it comes to training at long muscle lengths that don't necessarily need a new mechanism, but are sort of redundant with some of the things we already know and some of the things that we already see in practice?
Yeah. And I think a really good example of maybe the making a clear distinction between what we think of as long muscle length training and simply just stretching a muscle is the distinction between, let's say, like curling variations. So now if you're stepping into like exercise examples, there was that one study that was done on the preacher curl versus the incline curl, both with dumbbells. And so the incline curl puts the biceps at a longer muscle length, but the preacher curl had more load in the lengthened position. So then we start to need to talk about the differences between resistance profiles and resistance challenges and how those match up with strength curves, et cetera. So when it comes to extrapolating out research from these like animal-based studies, we also have to keep in mind the fact that we are human beings that are doing exercises that involve motion, and motion necessitates that we pay attention to more than just muscles and the length of the muscles, in the same sense that we also should pay attention to the joint structures and the stress on joint structures rather than just the muscle length thing. So I do feel like this is a very important conversation to have because it kind of opens the door to discussions that relate to this hyper focus we have around muscles and a sort of lack of focus that we have around other important variables such as stability, such as stability anchoring, such as let's say something like not necessarily tempo, but really how tempo can influence the outcome of where something is heavy and light. Things like resistance profile, the difference between cables and barbells and dumbbells and machines, and the list of things goes on. So I guess the important takeaway is just yet again that whenever we tend to focus on a single variable, we often do it at the expense of thinking about many others. And in the context of exercise, that can be potentially damaging or misleading when we are sacrificing, let's say, five important variables for just one. The example that we brought up in the past, or that I still like to talk a lot about, is people denouncing leg extensions in favor of, let's say, other variations for the quads, like a reverse Nordic or like a partial squat or something like that. Yeah, and it's also weird too, just because like in practice, the most jacked people are usually doing just a variety of exercises anyways. So on the one hand, it's kind of like, well, we have this really clear evidence in front of us that leg extensions seem like a decent option. So just on a very practical and maybe simple level, it seems that we're going to eventually just work our way back to that. I think in research settings where we're going to see more and more stuff in the future come out that may indicate like, hey, doing a variety of things longer term is probably going to be more of a net positive than just picking this one thing or this other thing, much in the same way that like varying your food selection slightly might benefit your digestion or something along those lines. Somewhat of a silly comparison. um, but do think it's important to mention. And I think the last thing that I'll say before you, if you have anything else to add, is just that the variable that I think is most often ignored at the expense of this long length thing is just the stability thing. I think that's probably the number one thing that we see that is limiting people in ways that are undesirable. The reverse Nordic, just because I brought it up, is a perfect example of where, yeah, maybe we do train the rec fem at a longer length, but simultaneously we have all these other things to manage that have nothing to do with the quads. And so to me, it kind of comes back to that same idea of, do we just have these very basic variables in check? Not that they need to be hyper focused on either, right? That would sort of miss the point entirely, which is just this idea that any single variable should sort of reign supreme. And that anytime you see someone making a conclusion, broadly speaking, about an exercise based on a single variable, that's kind of a time to maybe rave or raise a little bit of a red flag around the claim or around just the discussion if it becomes sort of too minorly or too nuanced in a way that really isn't that helpful. Do you have anything else to say on that?
Yeah, I think one major concept in what you were just describing is the idea of sort of like binary thinking, just black and white, good or bad. It is common for someone to come up to me in the gym when I'm doing an exercise and be like, is this the best? Is
Mm-hmm.
this good? Is this bad? Um, if you take stability, for example, and someone says, well, there's really no research to back the idea that stability matters when it comes to making an exercise more effective. Like we have all this research on, volume, and we have research, on training to failure and long muscle lengths, but show me the research that, making exercise more stable matters. And you could be like, all right, let's take a seat in this lat pull down. And you put the thigh pad, on top of, just above your knees, and do your 10 rep max. And then we'll take away the thigh pad and do your 10 rep, try one rep, with that way. Or same thing
Mm-hmm.
with seated leg curl. Do your 10 rep max, take away the thigh pad, tell me how that works out for you. And like, yeah, we don't have research directly comparing using the thigh pad versus not using the thigh pad in those two scenarios. But when your ass can't do a single rep with the weight that you just did for 10, it should be like, well, yeah, I don't have research saying that if I like touch a hot stove that it's going to burn me. And it also matters how much I turn up that stove, right? So like if it's not on at all, or if it's been on low for 3 seconds, like I'll probably be fine. So if you're weak and you go to do a standing cable chest press, you probably don't notice the fact that not having something behind you is a major issue. But if you're even reasonably strong at all, and you work up to a weight that's, like your 6 to 8 rep max standing cable chest press, you're going to realize that the biggest limitation is just not falling backwards. And that just applies to so many exercises. And having an anchor at a given point is going to become more valuable based on what the torque demands are at that point in the range. So how strong are you? What is your body weight? Is that an anchor in and of itself? What part of the range of motion are we in? Is that anchor directly sort of opposing that direction of resistance? So the context really matters. You know, how much I turn up that stove amplifies it all. But to say it doesn't matter at all is pretty asinine. Like it clearly matters in it's like it matters 100%. You know, it's like the zero sum kind of thing. It's like what's more important, training or nutrition? Well, don't eat for 3 months and tell me that, you know, training's the most important thing. So it has to be there in a sense. And if you recognize that these aren't just binary things and that sometimes it matters more than others, and there's no perfect scenario where you just have like usually not setting up an exercise where you just have the perfect amount of anchor for every part of that range. You're just picking and choosing, and you know you're sort of making a dish out of it, and every one of those is going to come out slightly different, and there's going to be pros and cons, you know, to how you set these things up. But it's so obvious that it matters in a situation like the leg curl and pull down that I described. Like, do you really need research telling you like if you can do 10 reps or 0 reps that doesn't matter? Just go down to 10 pounds on the seated leg curl, do all your sets there, and it should be the same. Like I don't think
Hmm.
that's something that we need to look at, but maybe we should, just to like maybe someone should run a study where one group uses the thigh pad and the other doesn't, just to get this point across. Uh, so there's that. You know, I think resistance profile falls into the same category. To your point, I think the anchoring is, you know, technically again, it's kind of the zero sum thing, but I think in practice, the anchoring is more relevant because it's not just like an all or nothing thing with the profile, where it's like you have an exercise that just literally has zero resistance except for one point in the exercise. Like there's just some decent amount of resistance, and some are, you know, aligned with your strength profile better than others. But in general, you can work pretty hard. Maybe on some you need to do slightly more sets than others, but it's not like a tenfold difference where you can use 10% of the weight on the lat pull down and seated leg curl, you know, without the pad than you can with the pad. So I think
Hmm.
the magnitude of difference just in practice is different between the anchoring and the resistance profile. But I think the concept of the resistance profile still fits into that like hot stove thing. Like I think there it does matter at the extremes as well. And I think that example that you gave of the curling variations, like the preacher versus the incline curl, is a perfect example because we're not in a machine. So maybe people don't think of that as a resistance profile per se, but it's just another expression of a resistance profile. And I think, you know, ultimately just coming back to this long training at long muscle lengths concept, you know, we're dealing with resistance profiles in this scenario as well. And I think as we look across exercises, you gave the example of the curl, but also when we look at things like squats and leg presses, where now we're dealing with a resistance profile where at the top of the movement, you're really strong. Like you have a lot of leverage as you're moving towards the top of the squat versus the bottom of the squat. So when you see people like put bands and chains, you know, on an exercise like a squat or like a bench press, you could say, well, that's taking tension, you know, that's taking resistance out of the bottom part of the motion. But at the same time, is it just a situation where we're able to fill more little rocks in that bucket? Because even though you could say, oh, the lengthen is the most important, but is it really just that the most important is to get more rocks in the bucket?
Mm.
I think that's really what we're looking at the end of the day, because when you look at studies and also just try it in practice, like when you just listen to podcasts here and there, like, you know, Revive Stronger or whatever, and they get people on there like, yeah, I've been just doing all, you know, long muscle length training, and I'm kind of finding that I really like it for back stuff, and I like it for calf stuff, and I like it for middle delt stuff. But like when I try to do it on squats and RDLs, everyone's like, yeah, I didn't usually stick with that. And then also in the research, you don't really see a clear benefit to doing lengthened partials because we all kind of know what it feels like to go down, to the bottom of the squat and just do partials there versus being able to lock out and how much load we can move. I'm not even saying that it would necessarily be worse. Like maybe you could, in some instances, get the same benefit from doing that under the right conditions. But in other setups, we see better results doing length partials where you don't tend to see that. For example, in the research on average or in practice, people don't tend to stick with doing like partial RDLs and partial squats out of the bottom. Maybe they'll do some like 1.5 reps, come all the way up with the squat, do a half rep at the bottom, all the way up. But you don't see a lot of people sticking with, all right, I'm just going to do a bunch of partial reps in the bottom of the squat or the RDL. And I think that also plays into that resistance profile conversation and just like the more is more concept of, yeah, most of the time what we're seeing is that by staying in the lengthened position, but a lot of that has to do with the previous constraints that we talked about, whether that be the ability to anchor, whether that be the resistance profile of the exercise, etc. Maybe we're just able to get more output there, but in a situation where we're not able to get more output there, we don't seem to see the same benefits. So I think that's at least one way to maybe frame this thought process around lengthened partials, at least until we have more research looking specifically at the mechanisms, if they are indeed separate in some way.
Yeah, a little bit of a silly comparison, but when you were talking about using the thigh pad versus not using the thigh pad in something like a pull down, I thought of the question of like, well, why don't we have studies that show that like parachutes are effective for jumping out of planes? It's like the parachute condition for relationships, or it's the parachute's condition to the relationship of like, jumping out of a plane without a parachute. It's kind of a stupid example, but to the point, I think that a lot of the anchoring principles are kind of taken for granted when in reality they're kind of like the prerequisite to any of this stuff. A good example that you and I have talked about, I don't know if about on the podcast, but I encourage anyone listening to try to do leg curls without the thigh pad on the leg curl. That one's the biggest, potentially most obvious example uh, of where it becomes really problematic to try to do the exercise. Um, and I think that in general, like lying down on a bench, for example, to do dumbbell presses is just something that we do. It's not something that we really think about, but why we lie down on the bench to do a dumbbell press and why we're okay with doing standing cable presses versus doing seated cable presses, like that's really just an issue of not being able to recognize like the sort of principles of what I think we need to understand to make a good exercise selection. And the long length conversation also gets really interesting too when you start to look at different muscle groups. So, for example, we could compare like bottom half leg extensions to top half leg extensions and conclude that the bottom half is more hypertrophic. But I was thinking the other day about how different the outcomes would be. And this is just sort of on a principle based level, something I want to make clear, which is like how different would the results be if we compared like a trunk rotation exercise, where in one example, let's say we were loading just the lengthened half of the trunk rotation versus just the shortened half. Well, when we talk about the trunk, like the trunk and trunk muscles are very mechanically different than something like your quads, right? So if you, for example, if you only did like a lengthened half trunk rotation in a machine or something, you may really only see hypertrophy local to the tissues that are able to actually pull you out of that lengthened position. Just to paint a more concrete picture for people, if I am turned to my left and I am turning to my right as the exercise, the things that pull me out of that fully turned left position and turn me to the right initially are going to be my left external oblique to some degree and my right internal oblique. So if I'm turning right, it's like left internal oblique, left external oblique, right internal oblique. But then the second half of that motion to finish the rotation, my left external oblique can't continue to turn me in that opposite direction. Again, this is just like a thing that is specific to those tissues. So if you just did the lengthened half of the trunk rotation, it's like your left external oblique might be on fire. Whereas if you just did the right portion, the second portion, the shortened portion, your right internal oblique would be the thing that is like pretty much doing all the work. So we can suggest this as a general concept, but even if there's one example wherein the outcome of this motion comparing lengthened and shortened halves is completely distinct, well, then we have to make sure that we qualify the general statements to say, hey, this may be true for this particular case, but if all of a sudden you're talking about a different motion or a different group of muscles, or even a situation which is less anchored, then all of a sudden this conversation has to become something completely different, and we have to contextualize it then to those specific scenarios. One other example in the case of the trunk rotation might just be like, your right QL. Like your right QL is going to be really good at turning you out of that initial thing, and your right QL is basically going to do nothing in that second half of the turning toward the right. So that's maybe a little bit more of an abnormal circumstance. People aren't really, I think, applying this to motions like trunk rotations quite yet. But if they were, and they were feeling all these weird things and they weren't quite sure as to why, well, it's because there's more than just the length of the muscle that needs to be considered when like we're making exercise decisions. And that's a good example of where it might be relevant. And then, of course, you could also have the anchoring conversation in that context as well, where it's like, well, how much can I really overload the length and position of a trunk rotation exercise if I'm using a cable, if I don't have something to actually support my body from falling over? Now, all of a sudden, it's still a lengthen bias thing. It's still a lengthen partial thing. But why is the outcome so different? Well, because this other variable that we weren't considering that we took for granted before in this other scenario, now it's no longer present in this context that we're trying to assess. And now all this confusion gets created because before the variables just were never considered to begin with. So I think that when you start to see those drastic differences, then you're kind of forced to grapple with the additional things that you have to consider. But if we're using exercises, machine-based things, pressing variations, we don't really have to consider those other variables. We're not really forced to in those particular cases. So I think that trunk rotation kind of can illuminate a lot about the other things that we need to consider and how these variables are actually things to consider in other instances. They're just not as clear to us or not as obvious. Um,
Another example with like comparing the anchoring to the profile or the anchoring to the muscle length conversation could be like a cable curl, where in the study you have one group step really far forward and there's like a large moment to the shoulder as well as the elbow. So they're facing away from the cable stack. They walk really far forward, and one group just does, lengthen partial curls, stepped way forward on the cable, and the other group does like a preacher curl. You could say, all right, well, the preacher curl group is starting from a shorter position, but it also has, better anchor. Um, you might see different results than you expect. And then more in practice, people might be saying, well, I don't do, a lot of trunk exercises like that. But I think anytime we start to move into like multi-joint exercises, let's say like, for example, a row, there could, and we're talking about lots of muscles, as we alluded to before with the back, there could be some differentiation there in terms of like what tissues are being trained at what length on a specific exercise. So it may simply just be like, what's the measurement point? A similar thing happens in training to failure, where it's like, if you're just measuring, let's say, the pecs on a bench press, and you say, all right, the pecs training like 2 or 3 reps in reserve grew just as much as training to failure, Well, what about, for example, the triceps and the front delts and the other muscles involved? So you need to actually measure a lot of different sites to get the full picture of what's happening. Because sometimes when we're talking about an orchestration of muscles, there's like a handoff effect that's happening, and sometimes just going closer to failure or going through the entire quote range of motion, getting into the short position, you might be handing off, you might be distributing stress in different ways than if you weren't training to failure, you weren't getting into those positions. So in situations where you can create a similar amount of total stress, but still move through the entire range, it's probably advantageous to do that at least some of the time.
Hmm. Yeah, and for whatever reason, the example to your point about the cable curl variation differences, the example of the overhead triceps extension versus the arms at the sides triceps extension, that was a study done, I think, in by Mao et al. In 2021 or 22, where they found that the overhead extension grew all of the triceps more than the neutral extension. And everyone is making theories about, oh, why did the overhead extension grow all the triceps more? In theory, it should have only grown the long head of the triceps more. Some people said, oh, maybe it's an occlusion effect from the position of your arm. Maybe it's a resistance profile thing. People aren't realizing it. I actually think that the overhead extension in many ways is just actually a lot easier to stabilize, meaning it's a lot easier to resist counter forces at the shoulder than something like a neutral extension, where in a neutral extension, people are often set up like with a rope where their arm is getting pulled forward substantially. But when the arm is in an overhead position, it's actually quite easy to resist the shoulder forces. Most of the time, the cable is actually quite close to the shoulder. So, was it a long length difference? Well, clearly, it wasn't a long length difference because the single joint heads grew more. And the answer to why the overhead extension maybe grew the single joint triceps more could be elucidated had we just focused on all the variables simultaneously rather than one. Now, research is meant to focus on a single variable. It's meant to try to standardize things to make conclusions about, single questions. And that's what research is for. But then when people in the lay public or people who are on social media, influencers, are trying to dissect this stuff, they're kind of missing the point when you take a single study to make a very broad generalization. That's like the most anti-scientific thing that you can do, right? It's commonly known as cherry picking, and it's known as cherry picking because research is often meant to answer a single question or a central question, which is not always meant to be at least extrapolated out more broadly. And I think that that's mostly what people who are citing studies, who are putting PubMed links, in posts, I think that's what they're doing is they're cherry picking studies to support whatever claim or notion they have, while sort of just like, conveniently ignoring all the other things that maybe could have influenced an outcome in that scenario. Not to mention the fact that a lot of people probably just aren't even really doing overhead extensions, at least that's my observation in like the general public, which is like most people just prefer to grab the triceps rope and just start banging away at it. Like you don't see many people who are just normal people setting up like a super specific katana, extension. So like it could also be the novelty and so on. Um, so
The
yeah, yeah, go ahead.
the katana thing brought me back to what this kind of fucked up actually, but it brought me back to when I was saying earlier, like where was the lengthen research or where was the stretching research coming out
Yeah.
of? So where my brain was just kind of cycling through, it was thinking like, okay, there was like a pioneer in this research who just did a ton of the recent studies on lengthened bias training. And I sort of conflated that with when BFR came out, there was one person who was really pioneering a lot of that stuff. And that was the like Katsu method, and that was in Japan. Um, but the person who did the stretching studies was actually out of Germany. And
Okay.
so at least, we're in like the right part, the general direction on the globe.
Yeah, over the pond.
This was Warneke in Germany, but it just stood out to me of like, okay, in each of those individual cases, there was just like one person and obviously a whole team of people, and there were other people doing research, I'm sure, simultaneously. But in both of those instances, there was kind of like a single pioneer who was not American and was not like easily accessible by us, who was, pumping out this research. And it had kind of the same feel, when BFR came out
Mhm.
to the lengthened stuff. And I think that's kind of where it got just sort of melded together in my brain.
Yeah, I do feel like this long length trend will follow a similar trend to the BFR in that
Yeah,
it will be this huge thing and then just like extend the
yeah.
timeline out and people will kind of calm the fuck down.
They both have the same feel to me. That's why they kind of get conflated. It's like I'll still use BFR, and even before this research came out, I was still doing uh, length and partials. So I think those things will continue to have use cases, but they may not be. When BFR was first popular, it was like, well, should we do everything as BFR? The same way that we're asking now, should we do everything as length and partials? So I can see why my brain just kind of lumps those things as like, okay, this is a useful paradigm. Just like BFR, I think taught us a lot about just ways of thinking about a resistance training stimulus. It was around the same time that we were starting to figure out that like training at higher rep ranges was producing equal results, at least like on a whole muscle level for hypertrophy. So we're still kind of in this space where all these things work. They all seem to produce equal amounts of hypertrophy in the way that we're currently measuring it. We can't really pull them apart yet in terms of like when we would use one thing over another outside of just practical application. So we're kind of in a spot where it's like, well, BFR seems to be about as effective as traditional training. And the average use case right now is just like when people are injured. That's the most common use case, or for some reason they just want to train with lighter loads. But it's just simply that practically it's kind of more of a pain in the ass to do BFR because you need an implement and it takes some additional time to wrap that thing or pump it up or whatever. So it's just a little bit more of a pain than just doing, say, like normal training or higher rep training if you wanted to use lighter loads or modifying the rest periods, etc. Whereas like the length and partial training, it's pretty practical, which helps its ability to spread as well.
Yeah. So one of the other things that came up for me just as you were talking in relationship to rep ranges is a lot of the times a common recommendation for dealing with pain is to use really high rep ranges. And I think that that can be a useful heuristic for someone who is not super knowledgeable on the setup and execution bits. Like they maybe just don't really know what to look for, which is totally fine. And like, why would you if you were just a normal person? But I think when that gets extrapolated out to situations like everywhere, I think it can start to become a problem. So, for example, if you're like training with a triceps extension in the 8 to 12 range and you're experiencing some kind of elbow ouchie, which a lot of people will just say is tendonitis. Like tendonitis is just the name that people just give things when they're in experiencing discomfort. A lot of times,
After any discomfort,
what say it again?
it's the itis after like any
Yeah, yeah,
like I'm getting tired. I got the benitis, like I'm just tired
yeah.
of my voice, like it's causing an inflammatory response. So it generally works. Just have some kind of prefix and then itis.
Yeah, the long length itis, stretch itis is going to be something that people are going to start to run into. Um, but anyway, what they'll do is they'll say, oh, instead of doing 8 to 10, I'm going to do 25, 30 reps. I'm just going to get a sick pump and it's going to be great. I'm going to have no pain. I find that, there may be scenarios in which whatever you're experiencing is just acutely painful. And like maybe you just you need some rest. Like there's no other solution. You just need less stress on the area. So you resort to higher reps or maybe pauses, slower tempo. But that's just all a way to just reduce the immediate term stress. But I do find that a lot of people that end up trying to do that end up in a kind of infinite loop doing that, where it's like they're able to train normally, quote unquote, in heavy for some amount of time, and then they resort to these higher rep phases. And I think that's how a lot of like programming strategies were built, was just people not really knowing how to manage like the acute technical differences between variations that feel good and that don't, or that are more well aligned for them and that are less well aligned, and instead just opting for the next like most convenient variable to change, which is just something like rep range and as a consequence the amount of load that they're using. So it's more just like something I say with caution, or to caution people that if you are experiencing some kind of discomfort, like dropping the load and tripling the reps could be a solution for you, but I don't think that it should be the solution. I think that the solution should either be to change the way that you're doing the exercise, which may result in you using less load. But it shouldn't be the sort of first line of defense that you use to try to troubleshoot these things. Because although you may be able to handle the stress of a 20 or a 30 rep set in terms of your pain perception, it doesn't mean that you're actually getting rid of the issue. And it could be the thing that actually allows you to continue to do the stressful thing, just at a level that is less perceptible, just at a level that is more sustainable in the shorter term. So, my personal rule of thumb is to try to, if I'm experiencing pain in an exercise, is try to like keep the exercise mostly the same in terms of the range and the amount of load that I'm using, but just to try to make a tweak to the exercise such that I can still use relatively heavier loads, but also so that I can mitigate pain. So a good example for me would be if I'm doing a rope extension, just doing it single arm, or if I'm doing, a curl with a dumbbell, right, doing a curl with a cable or something like that, where I don't have to intentionally triple the rep range or drop the load in half, but where you can still use an appreciable amount of load doing something very similar, but that you change the joint stress just enough so that you can continue to do what you initially set out to with an actual, substantial amount of load that you could call a working load for you. So, and I do think that's really, really big still in bodybuilding. It's just the high rep method, the high rep framework, which I think on average is probably very helpful to people. Like you just doing sets in the 10 to 15 rep range as opposed to the 5 to 10. I think generally speaking is easier on people for a lot of reasons. But I think when you start to get to the extremes of 20, 25, 30, 40, you're just wasting a lot of time and potentially avoiding addressing the actual root cause of the issue. Um, but, as has been the case with you in a number of instances, sometimes it's just like, hey, on this week or on these 2 weeks, I'm just going to I'm just going to intentionally do a little bit less so that I don't have to sort of continue to dig myself into this hole. Um, and I think that, recent example, like with the triceps, if you could maybe just mention that one, I think is a good example, like something concrete for people.
Mhm. Yeah. So try not to give too much backstory here because I could go on a really big tangent. But what you're referring to specifically is just the total amount of weight um, that I need to use. And I specifically say weight and not like torque or resistance, just because it's simply like where I'm putting the pin at the bottom of the stack. The stack says, 250 or whatever. And, where I'm holding the weight, whether it's a wrist cuff, whether I'm holding it in my hand, makes a big difference in terms of those things I mentioned, the overall resistance that I'm experiencing. But that 250 pounds that says the number on the stack still has an influence elsewhere. It still has an influence on the amount of restraint that I need in terms of just managing things at the trunk, for example. Um, and as I mentioned before, just as you scale up the magnitude of these things, as you get stronger and stronger, you're in a sense dealing with bigger rocks going into the bucket. And I think it's just easier to overfill that bucket. So sometimes I do think maybe those higher rep strategies, as you mentioned, at the extremes can be really beneficial because you're just dealing with such a high level of magnitude of stress per individual rep. You know, if you can squat 700 pounds for reps versus, 135, that's where the example of like, well, why do most bodybuilders do leg curls, leg extension, maybe even abduction, adduction, maybe even other exercises and end up doing squats and deadlifts last versus the beginner does the 5x5, program and just walks into the gym and does a warm up set or two. So the example here for triceps was much like the leg extension example was just simply I put a short bias tricep exercise before the other two I was doing, and that allowed me to reduce the load on those other two. And then also I played around with just the application of where that resistance was in terms of it being a wrist cuff versus like holding onto a handle versus holding onto the ball, and played around with those things. I mean, one of the best strategies for me in recent years in regards to deloading is I just changed my intent on the exercise and I changed the sort of mental anchoring that I have. So even though I've mentioned many times on this podcast, the way that I look at progression overall is not necessarily that we are, in a sense, aiming to progress every session, but witnessing progression is a sign that we are overloading. So just I want to be able to look back over time and observe that I'm making progress, but I'm not necessarily going into the set with the idea of this set needs to be more on paper than before, because I'm aware of the fact that there are a lot of variables that go into what is more, not just simply that it says 200 pounds versus, 202.5 pounds, right? That's something that I can witness, just like when I look at the stack and it says 250, is that 250 pounds? Well, it depends what kind of cable stack I'm on. It might be 125 pounds. And if it's 125 pounds, where is it 125 pounds? So it's such a moving target. And when you actually understand how complex and dynamic these things are, you realize that what you write on the paper is, a gross oversimplification of what is happening on a not only just like a physics level, but also just on a signaling level inside your body. It's such a complex system, and we're looking at these outputs far removed from the actual stimulus. So that's all to say that like we want to observe progress over time, but I'm not necessarily trying to just force it onto a piece of paper. So as I've mentioned before, I will typically write the results of the set in a different place than I write the exercise name, the seat and pad settings, and also the weight that I'm using. So, I do 200 pounds for 15 reps. I write 15 in a different part of the log where I can't see it next time I go to do the set. And then maybe next time I do 200 for 16. Or if I'm doing 3 sets, maybe it's 15 reps, 13 reps, 10 reps. And maybe I get 15 again on the first set, but maybe I get 14 on the second set. And as long as I'm observing some sort of change like that over time, doesn't have to be every session, but just a trend in that direction of being able to do more without going into the set saying that, oh, I did 15 last time, therefore I'm going to force, 16 this time. There's a lot of ways to force that might not even be a true progression. You may be able to create, the appearance of doing that many reps without necessarily moving at the same speed or having the same intent, or, even placing stresses on other segments and using leverage through other muscles that you might not have before. So you're creating the appearance of progression, but not necessarily an adequate stimulus for it. So what I'll often do on a deload is I'll take what I do for my second set on sort of like the normal part of a block, which is to not count reps at all and just focus on the internal sensations. I'll still use about 70 to 80% of the load that I'm using for the first set. But on the second set, using that 70 to 80% of the load, I'm just trying to do each rep as perfectly as I can based on my understanding of the exercise. So it might be a pause in a lengthened position. It might be really controlling the eccentric. It may, in some instances, being using a little bit less momentum to certain parts of the range. It might be squeezing a little bit more into a short position, something that's not taking too much away from my overall output, but ultimately I will usually get slightly less reps with slightly less load just by really focusing on the sensation and focusing on making the quality as conceptually perfect as possible, so that when I go into a deload, I might just do all my sets like that. Like I'll still train to the appearance of failure, but the way that I'm doing it is with a very internally minded intent and with absolutely no focus on the outcome at all. So I think you can kind of scale this outcome focus of like, I don't know how many reps I'm trying to get, but I'm still trying to get as many reps within these constraints as possible. To I'm not even going to count reps at all, and I'm not even going to have a focus on improving the outcome. I'm just simply going to create the greatest amount of sensation. Again, abiding by rules that are sort of realistic within the framework of the exercise you're using, but just trying to sort of harken back to how you started the block in terms of, all right, can I get the most out of every single rep with the least amount of load, regardless of how many reps I'm doing?
Mhm.
And I wouldn't, bet my entire bodybuilding career that you get the same stimulus both ways, because obviously I'm doing it on a deload. And I can tell you by training that way, if I have little like nicks and niggles, like it does tend to benefit those things. So I still think there is absolutely a place to anchor yourself to the idea of improving and tracking performance so that you can see a representation of an adequate stimulus and adequate adaptation over time. But I do think instead of just looking at the numbers and saying, all right, I'm going to cut my sets in half, or I'm going to reduce the load, or I'm going to train with this many reps in reserve, you can simply just shift your intent a lot of times, and that can affect the way you're creating that output.
Yeah, and I think that to theorize, that's why a big part of why the mind muscle connection became such a prominent focus for bodybuilders, which is that like maybe people just realized experientially that trying their hardest and just trying to push more load was just not sustainable. So they kind of needed to develop a way, like a form of a technique that was like inherently you just had to use less load. You had to kind of move more slowly to achieve that outcome of the mind muscle thing. Into our conversation earlier, I think that's yet another representation of where you can inject some kind of variability in your training to make it more sustainable, right? So in the same way that you would do a long and a short exercise, you might within the same exercise alter the intent so that you have some variability within that window of more length or more shortening or more load or less load or more reps or fewer reps.